Hello and welcome. This is a Public Affairs Forum sponsored by the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin, Texas. My name is Luther Elmore. We hold these forums at our church most Sundays. We've been holding these forums since 1954, the year this church was first incorporated. We hope to further the mission of this church, to nourish our minds and our spirit, and to bring us to social action and social commitment. These forums are held on Sundays, shortly after noon, and we invite you to join us. They're free and open to the public, and we'd love for you to be here and to share your questions with our presenters. Information about the forums can be accessed at our church website, austinuu.org. Today we're very happy to welcome Mr. Andrew Dobbs. Andrew is a legislative and program director for the Texas Campaign for the Environment, where he has worked for the last 8 years. He is originally from Dallas-Fort Worth area, Allen. He attended UT, and for the last 8 years he's been involved with the Texas Campaign for the Environment, working on environmental issues not only here in Central Texas and Austin, but all over the state. Most people never think twice about their trash, and that's what Andrew's going to be talking about today. He's going to be talking trash to us. Most people don't think about their trash. They just throw it away. As Andrew shared with us, there really is no away. When we haul it off, we just haul it somewhere else. It's just taking it from one place to another. Communities are being exploited by the waste industry and rising up to demand changes to a system rigged in favor of multinational garbage corporations. Trash is choking our oceans and our land, but there is real hope and action available to us. We are looking forward to Andrew's presentation today, and we welcome him to our forum. Andrew.
Thank you, Luther. Thank you, everybody. Everybody hear me? Great. Thanks. Good to see y'all. As Luther said, I'm Andrew Dobbs. I'm the program director and legislative director with Texas Campaign for the Environment. I was telling him and some other folks, Rich, earlier that my grandfather was a Southern Baptist preacher, and I learned I became comfortable with public speaking by pretending to be a preacher when I was a kid, because that's what I thought I wanted to be, and so my grandmother wanted me to be, but I think if they were good Southern Baptists, so I don't know how they would handle the Unitarian part of this, but I think, but they're fine. So I appreciate you having me. I'm grateful to be here for sure. And like you said, I'm with Texas Campaign for the Environment. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan citizens group. We're statewide. We have full-time offices here and in Dallas and down in Houston. The way that we raise most of our money and organize our membership is through a door-to-door canvas. And so some of y'all have probably gotten that knock at your door and had the folks ask you to get involved in an issue, sign on, write some letters to decision makers, and give us some money, because that's how we're able to raise our funds. And that's what makes us independent and accountable to the people of Texas, to the public interest of the state of Texas, and not to any specific donor or other interest group. And we were able to raise more than 90% of our funds that way. We not only organize here and all across Central Texas, not just in Central Austin, but going out to all the suburbs here, Leander and Georgetown, all the way down south to San Marcos, even down to San Antonio, and all over the North Texas, DFW Metroplex, all over the greater Houston area. We also send out teams of our organizers to far-flung parts of Texas. Just this past week, we were down in South Texas. We had people in Beeville and Aransas Pass and a variety of other places around there. We've had people go as far as Seminole, Texas, on the Texas-New Mexico border in the Panhandle. We've gone out to El Paso, to Big Spring, to Tyler and Longview, to all kinds of points in between. And what we find everywhere we go is that Texans are desperate for environmental leadership, and that people respond incredibly positively wherever we go, because that is what people need in this state. And unfortunately, we live in a political moment where people make assumptions about other people before they meet them, where we close off conversations before we've even had a chance to meet somebody. And Texas Campaign for the Environment bucks that trend and opens those conversations and finds that there's a receptiveness there. And this forum is in that same tradition, I believe, and it's it has the same spirit of openness and believing that dialogue is the solution here. And so I'm incredibly grateful to be invited here and to participate in this. So that's who Texas Campaign for the Environment is. The topic I wanted to talk about today is there is no way, and about the urgent politics of trash in Texas. And as noted, it's actually an interesting story about how Texas Campaign for the Environment came to be involved in these issues in the first place. And I think that story is actually really indicative of the importance of this issue. Because if when we think about environmental issues, we start plugging in on them, there's a few things that we all think about. And the most notable right now, of course, is climate change and climate action. And that's really important, obviously. But the connections between this and that aren't always obvious. And it was unlikely connections that actually got us involved in this. Back in the day, in the 1990s and around the turn of the century, TCE was, in fact, very much focused on air quality issues. Some of y'all may remember that. And in fact, it became, because we had our door-to-door canvas, and the other door-to-door canvas in town was Clean Water Action, who I also worked for at one point, love them, support them too. But when we come to the door, people would always be like, are you clean water or clean air? It's like, we're the clean air folks. Oh, okay, let me go get my checkbook, kind of thing. So, that was how we operated. It was before my time there, but our executive director, Robin Schneider, who a lot of y'all know, she was there then. Zach Trahan, who's still our development coordinator, he actually works remotely from his home in Costa Rica, believe it or not. He was there at that time. So that was kind of our modus operandi, was the air stuff. And we were working on air issues, and we went to neighborhoods in northeast Travis County, right around Springdale and 290. And we started knocking on doors out there, and we're like, hey, we're here to talk about air quality issues and air pollution. And they're like, you want to talk about air quality? Let's talk about the fact that it stinks all the time here, and we're getting sick from this landfill next door to us. And it was one of those, wait, what? What are you talking about? And we realized, and they're like, it's really bad all the time. It's this massive landfill. And in fact, at that time, it was two massive landfills. The so-called Austin Community Landfill, which is still in operation today and is owned and operated by Waste Management Incorporated. And at the time, there was also I'm going to say so-called, they love to do this with landfills, it's called the Sunset Farms Landfill. Yes, they like to do that sort of thing. So the Sunset, just like the new proposed landfill for Caldwell County, it's just north of Lockhart, it's called the 130 Environmental Park. So yeah, it's just wonderful, but it's a big giant pile of garbage is what it is. So the Sunset Farms landfill up there, and so we started digging in on that issue. We started talking to people, and we really responded to it. We got out there to talk about air quality, and we ended up talking about trash. Because when you have big giant piles of garbage like that, you start looking at sulfuric gases and all kinds of other terrible, noxious gases that come off of these landfills and can make people sick, can definitely ruin people's property values and quality of life, and wreak all kinds of havoc on a community. They also nowadays, obviously methane is a big problem with them, which is less acute in terms of its immediate health impacts, but is a tremendous impact on our climate. It's a greenhouse gas. It's even more intense than carbon dioxide in the immediate term, which really that's all we have right now. And so we started. We through the kind of I hesitate to use intersectionality because I think it's used in a different way, but between those kind of connections between those waste issues, that's how we ended up from air quality into working on trash, and that carried us a long ways. And if you look at trash, it really does encapsulate all kinds of other issues as well. What is trash other than congealed. We talk a lot about energy and water in this town and in this state and in this environmental movement. And we think a lot about the energy water nexus, some of y'all may have heard of. Some that Dr. Michael Weber, who used to be at UT, I think he may be coming back at some point, but he's working in Europe now. He talked a lot about this, about how to create more energy, you need more water. And then to get more water, you need more energy, right? And so these two things are connected. Well, what are we using all that water and energy for, right? Our personal consumption is only a small fraction of it. The vast majority of the water and energy that's being used around the world is being used to produce products of one sort or another. And in many instances, in most instances, somewhere at the end of those lines is a consumer product, right? And those consumer products are the things that we consume and then throw away. Right, and we put them into the landfill. So the landfills are full of the legacy of our energy and water usage, and they are a testament to the complete lack of planning and sanity in this system, and the wastefulness and the unsustainability of the system. It is congealed water and energy being buried in the ground. It's so bad that I was at a conference here a couple of years ago, the U.S. Zero Waste Business Council conference, and then a speaker from the United Nations. And I hesitate to bring it up because I can't remember the exact number, but it was an obscenely large number, something in the order of like 3/4 or something, in that range, like 80%, some large number like that, of the world's resources that are mined are buried again underground somewhere else in a landfill within a year of their extraction. So what our current system is let's expend a ton of energy, a ton of resources, going out and pulling stuff out of the ground, turning it into consumer products, and then burying it somewhere else in the world, all within a year. And that system is obviously not sustainable, and it doesn't make any sense. And as you start to look at this, the intervening at the level of trash like we do is a way of interjecting yourself into all of these problems, right? And it's actually, when you look at, say, like climate change as well, obviously those things are connected to climate change, the energy and the water and the resource extraction that we're talking about. But how did we end up with trash in the first place? Why are these things disposable? How did we end up with that? Well, it's really interesting because what ended up happening in the 20th century is as we shifted to a petroleum-based economy, right? As we shift to a petroleum-based economy and we start refining all this petroleum, we end up with all these petrochemical fractions that don't have any other use, right? They're essentially waste products of oil refining. And what they realized was, hey, you know what? If we do a little bit of more chemistry on these, then we can turn them into plastics. And the plastics that we have today are the legacy of the wastes of the oil industry. And so that's how we end up with what we have today. And I think that the real important thing to remember here is that climate change is an accelerator for most of our environmental problems. That's its real nature, is that it is the foot on the gas pedal of environmental destruction of all sorts, right? And even if we lift our foot off the pedal, even if we can solve that problem, which is obviously the primary concern and the highest priority for all of us right now, right, is to lift our foot off that gas pedal, we're still headed in the wrong direction on a lot of fronts. And the wastefulness of our current system is a big part of that. And we have to solve this problem. And it's great because it actually works in both directions, right? As we start to solve this problem, it requires us to get to the root of the problems that cause the environmental destruction of climate change and so many other things like the destruction of our soils, the pollution of our oceans with garbage and everything else. It requires us to get at those problems, but it also makes sure that as we're solving those problems, we're creating a more sustainable future beyond that as well, if that makes sense. And so that's how TCE kind of got involved in these issues. How did the world get here, right? How did that absurd system that I just described, where we dig things out of the ground, take them on the other side of the world, and then bury them in the ground again a few months later, how did we get into that system? Because that doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem like something that we've done for a long time. And you would be right about that. In fact, waste as we understand it today is a relatively recent invention. Obviously, there have always been discards of one sort or another, but what there haven't been is large-scale, like wasteful societies. How did we get to that point? Why did we invent that? And the answers are pretty interesting, actually. If you look at it, prior to the 19th century, people didn't throw a whole lot away, right? You had, so to speak again. You had pretty much everything you consumed you would make yourself, or because most people lived in rural settings, lived on subsistence farms or in peasant type situations, tenant farms of some sort. People would produce most of what they needed for themselves. The handful of commodities that they needed to buy were usually very expensive for them and very difficult to obtain, and so they sought out durability, and they would use them forever. Right. In fact, a lot of times those things are still around today. That's what our family heirlooms are, and the things that we find in arts and crafts museums and that sort of thing. So that was the way that we lived for most of our lives. The things that you couldn't use really anymore, you had food scraps, right, to a certain extent, which you would feed to animals for the most part, pigs in particular, and chickens and that sort of thing, and then they would produce high quality fertilizer for you on the back end, right? And that's what you'd use on your gardens and farms, right? So that was your food scraps. And the most common other waste product that didn't really have any value beyond that were ashes, right? You cooked with wood, and so you had a lot of ashes, and you'd get rid of ashes. And that was what comprised our waste system prior to the mid to late 19th century. But in the mid to late 19th century, when you have urban industrialization, you have the industrial economy really come online, and it causes an urbanization. It pulls people off of those farms and out of those folkways, mostly by destroying their ability to sustain that, right? And using a variety of political and legal and military means to drive people off of their lands into the cities so that they become low-wage labor in the industrial system, right? And so you suddenly have cities explode in population. And very quickly, even in cities back in those days, you had animals wandering the street that would eat people's garbage and whatnot, right? And so you had that system already, but very quickly the population overwhelmed whatever nascent systems they had for dealing with discards. And you have garbage piling up in the streets. They say in some cities it'd be up to people's knees in the streets. It was filthy. And with this came disease. And epidemic outbreaks of cholera and typhoid and a variety of other illnesses that killed, thousands and thousands of people across North America, Europe, and other places that were doing this. And so it was a disaster. It was something that had to be solved. And what ended up happening was, it started in New York City in the 1890s. They formed the first ever sanitation department. And it was the city decided, nobody else is going to take care of this, so we're going to do this. And this was a progressive reform effort of that era. And they ended up charging taxes and using that tax money to collect garbage and to create a system for cleaning the streets, collecting the garbage, taking it out of the city, and disposing of it in landfills. Which landfills have existed for a long time. In fact, the Austin Community Landfill and Sunset Farms landfill, there's also an old Travis County landfill there. That site has been a waste site for over 100 years. Even before it was Austin up there, was a little town called Sprinkle, Texas. But they decided so they set up the sanitation department, and it was something of a miracle. The people of New York City actually held a massive citywide ticker tape parade in 1896, I believe, to celebrate the sanitation workers and to thank them for saving the city. And this is the point when I always, talk about that we should still celebrate our sanitation workers, because these people work one of the most dangerous and difficult jobs in our society, and they're invisible and disrespected in many ways. But they are heroes for us to this day, because we couldn't live the healthy, safe lives that we do today without their work, and they put their lives on the line. We have huge citywide funerals when a police officer or firefighter dies. Sanitation work is more dangerous than those jobs. It's one of the most dangerous jobs in America, and we should honor their sacrifice and their work to this day. But that's what happened in the 1890s, is they did celebrate them because it took trash out of the streets, and it made it so that the city was much healthier, much more livable, and it was safer to be a part of. But they inadvertently, in cities all over the world, started to emulate this model, right? It created an unintended consequence, though, right? Which is that it provided a government subsidy for wastefulness. It said, the end of life of your products will be taken care of by the government. And not just any government, by local governments, weirdly enough. It wasn't the state, it wasn't the federal government. And over time, states and federal governments have regulated these industries, but there is very little in the way of state or federal. There's no subsidies coming to local governments, or very little in the way of subsidies coming to local governments for these things. These things are handled by our local governments to this day. Or if you live in rural areas, usually it's just you and the private market that are doing it, right? So it created the system where it said, you know what, we're going to take care of your garbage, don't you worry about it. And that's where we get this system of away, right? And it's like, oh, we'll just throw it away. It used to be throw it out on the street, and then you're looking at it for the next 2 weeks until, you suddenly get an intestinal illness, but now it said, just throw it away, just put it out there, somebody's going to take it, and they're going to take it somewhere else, and you're never going to have to think about it again. And that subsidy did a couple of different things. One is, and what it really did is it created an externality. I've been remiss here in not defining waste, actually. We've all just assumed throughout the course of this talk that we all know what we're talking about. But there's an actual economic definition of waste, right? Which is, it's any product that has negative value, right? Things that have positive values are things that I pay you for. You have a nice computer that's barely used. I'm going to pay you several $100s for you to give it to me. You have a broken computer that is never going to be fixed. You have to pay me to take it away from you, right? That's the difference between a valuable product and a waste product, is it now has a negative value. So we created this system where those costs were being borne by the government, created that subsidy, and it created, and what that did is it externalized the cost of disposal from the economic transaction of buying a consumer product. For those who don't know, externalities, this is a big concept in sustainability and environmental policy, right? It's a fancy word, it's confusing for some people. All it means is a cost of a transaction that's borne by somebody who wasn't a party to that transaction, right? So I buy a watermelon from the watermelon store, right? And I had money, I give it to the watermelon man, he gives me the watermelon, I eat the watermelon, I'm left with a bunch of rinds, right? And I throw that into the trash, and that trash is taken to the Austin Community Landfill and dumped there, where it rots and causes it to stink, and somebody else's property value goes down, right? Now their property value went down. They were forced to pay for my watermelon in part. I didn't pay for that. The watermelon man didn't pay for that. They did. And what a lot of our policy has to be about, and this is, what I always say here is that if there is a solution to these problems internal to our way of life and internal to the systems that we have set up in general, which I'm not sure that that's the case, but if there are solutions, then the solution is going to be to find a way to internalize those costs back into our system. And right now what we have is a system where the government has subsidized wastefulness by saying, you know what, we'll take care of it, we're going to send it over here, don't worry about it. And of course, the way that we're able to do that is if the people that live by a way are people who themselves are externalized to our economic way of life, right, and to our political way of life. If it's low-income folks, people of color, other people that are marginalized in our system today. What's really interesting is that as we're seeing changes on these policies starting to emerge right now in Texas, it's predominantly because no longer are these neighborhoods and are these areas the low-income, black or brown neighborhoods. Now they're middle class, and with a lot of Anglo-American folks and whatnot living near them. There's the suburbs in many cases, and those people are like, wait, what's going on here? And that's actually causing us to start to get some political traction on these issues. But historically, that was not the case. In fact, it's not even just the case that it was economically externalized. It was very much a part of racial injustice in particular. I don't know if anybody here is familiar with Dr. Robert Bullard. He's a professor at Texas Southern University. He's known as the father of environmental justice. He kind of balks at that name a little bit. He says that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was the father of environmental justice because the final campaign that he worked on, of course, was for sanitation workers in the city of Memphis. But Dr. Bullard made his name and got to be that because he was the first person to ever bring civil rights lawsuits against polluters in the early 1980s. And one of his most famous books is called Dumping on Dixie. And the premise of that book, or the finding of that book, was that waste facilities in the city of Houston in particular, but this happened all across the South, they were sited in African-American neighborhoods, and it wasn't low-income neighborhoods. There was no correlation between income and the siting of waste facilities. It was race, 100%. They were putting them predominantly in middle-class black neighborhoods, and that they were used to break up the political power of African-American communities, to disperse them, and to force them into other parts of the city and as a political ploy against the power of black communities. So that's, we can externalize this cost, we can externalize this problem, we can put it on people who we don't care about anyways, and we can start to subsidize a wasteful society. And what ends up happening is that cascades through the entire system, and it makes it so that we can create disposable products. We can make things that are designed to be thrown away, right? Because away is always going to be there. That's what we have now, and I think that that's a really important thing to keep in mind. What you're seeing now is you're starting to see a variety of problem products being created, because especially as what we're seeing right now, and something that TCE is working on a lot, is that we're starting to see that the oil industry in particular, doesn't believe that they have much of a future in transportation. Right, we're seeing all the electric cars. We're starting to see people switch to other modes of transportation. We're starting to see greater urbanization, so that people are driving less. If you see, they can see the future, and the demand curve for petroleum for transportation purposes is leveling off or dropping, right? So they need to have but at the same time that supply is exploding, right? They keep having new discoveries. So what are they supposed to do? They're using it for plastic products. And that's why, like last night I was at the grocery store with my partner, and we were looking at buying some mayonnaise. And they have like this little pouch of mayonnaise, a little nozzle, right? It's like a little squeeze pouch, not a jar anymore. The jar is easily recyclable, right? We'll rinse it, throw it in the recycling container. That's going to get recycled easily. This pouch, that's completely unrecyclable. Like, there's under no circumstances could that be recycled, because each of those, it's going to be multiple layers of different polymers, because they had to get rid of each little fraction of the gas that they refined, right? So just a little digression there. Point being that we have a system that is getting worse on some of that. So where are we at on that today? Here in Texas, we have especially cheap trash. And that's a problem. And the reason that recycling is so popular and diversion is so popular in places like Europe or the West Coast or parts of the Northeast or Japan or wherever, in large part is because trash is really expensive there, right? When it costs you $100, $150 a ton to throw out your trash, suddenly recycling or composting not only is just like a nice thing to do, it's actually just cheaper, right? It just makes more economic sense to do it, and so everybody does it. Here, we have a really tough time with our trash competing with recycling, composting, source reduction, reuse, everything else, right? And it's really easy to just say, throw it away, send it to somebody else, right? And why is that? Obviously, there's some, natural functions of this, like Texas has wide open spaces and everything, right? So that's always going to be, we're always going to have challenges with that. But the state government has made it even harder for us by essentially subsidizing the waste industry, by creating rubber stamp systems for permitting waste facilities and having very weak processes for enforcement of waste regulations. And that's what Texas Campaign for the Environment is working on right now. When you look at it, let's talk about what I mean by that. In terms of the permitting, right now, if I want to build a landfill, let's say, landfill is a $65 million plus facility. It's going to last for decades, maybe even a century or more. It's a massive impact on people's well-being and quality of life and everything else. If I want to build that landfill, the application for it is about like this, right? It's like a bookshelf worth of paperwork. The application fee for that in the state of Texas is $150. $150, which means that the rest of us are subsidizing the cost of that application, right? Not only that, but they have a system where if you fill out the paperwork wrong or you leave things out of it, they issue what's called a notice of deficiency, where they say, okay, you didn't fill this out. And what they will issue an indefinite number of those notices of deficiency. And not only that, they will tell you specifically how to fill it out. And so essentially you can have the TCQ work as a sort of unpaid consultant for your landfill application. And they will do this over and over and over again. In fact, then you can actually leave parts of it off completely, and they will still issue you a permit with special conditions, saying, oh, well, you didn't actually do everything you're supposed to do to get this permit. Just make sure you come back to us later with that at some point. But here's your permit anyways. Okay? They have the notice of deficiency. I'm trying to remember all the different things here. They don't actually ever confirm any of the information in the application either. They just make sure that you filled it out. Right? It's just a check of the paperwork. They don't actually check anything. And they can have grossly inaccurate information in it. Like one application for an expansion in Houston that we're dealing with right now, that the expansion actually, they have it designed so that water is flowing uphill in part of the design. And David's laughing because he's an engineer. He knows that's not how water works. They've got it flowing uphill. There was another one in Waller County out west of Houston, right? That they said for years that there was no groundwater on the site at all, or if it was like hundreds of feet down. People who had property around that were like, no, that's not true. We know the groundwater here. That groundwater is just a few feet down, right? It's not very deep at all. And they said, no. They had to fight, lawsuit. Had to raise over $1 million for bake sales and garage sales and personal donations. And they finally got to go out on that site and they hand dug the groundwater. Okay, if they had let that be built, we would have had a municipal solid waste landfill sitting in an aquifer in Waller County, right? And that's the kind of thing that happens when you don't actually have to confirm anything in it. There's other things as well that I could keep going off of this, but the permitting process right now, in fact, it's not illegal to build over an aquifer recharge zone, and you're not supposed to be able to build in floodplains, but basically if you get a couple pieces of paperwork, you can build a landfill in a floodplain in the state of Texas. In fact, that same guy who's got the water flowing uphill on his map, the neighbors there are getting water flooding into their backyards off of this landfill anytime there's a sizable rain in Houston. So, this is the way that the permitting is working right now. We've got also the enforcement end. So you've already got a permit. I know that I'm getting close to Q&A time, but I'll wrap this up. The enforcement end of it is terrible as well. The most notable example of this is that what is the most common kind of impact from a landfill that you can imagine is smell, right? Odor. It's like the thing that everybody knows about. And here's the thing about odor is anytime anybody's like, oh, it's just odor. Well, odor is my nose picking up molecules in the air, right? And if my nose is picking up molecules that are malodorous, that means that there's dangerous air pollution in this area, right? Like our noses aren't that sensitive in the grand scheme of things. And if you're picking up odors from something like that, you are dealing with something that has a meaningful health impact. At the very least, it's a quality of life impact. Now, here's the thing about landfills and odor that you may not know is that landfills tend to stink at night, right? Because the sun warms gases on the landfill, they rise straight up, right? When the sun goes down and it cools off, the gases can go out laterally into the neighborhoods surrounding the landfill, so they tend to smell bad at night. Well, the TCEQ, if you call in with an odor complaint, it takes them a week or two to show up, and they're going to show up 9 to 5. They're not going to show up at 11 o'clock at night or 1 in the morning. They're not going to show up. They say that they're trying to recreate all the conditions that existed when the odor was there, but it's like, well, the odor stunk at night, and you're here in the middle of the day. You're here when it's least likely to stink. I need you there when it's most likely to stink. That's just one of many examples. The other big example, the big kind of fundamental example, is that essentially right now what you have are waste operators saying, you know what, the cost of, here's how much it would cost for us to legally operate our facility. And here's how much it would cost for us to break the law and just pay the fine whenever they happen to come by. And it's cheaper to do that, so we'll just budget in the fines. We'll budget in breaking the law, and that's going to be our system. The final point I'll make on that actually is that even then, they found ways to make it even easier to obey the law. Namely, so the way that a landfill is supposed to work is you're supposed to dry entomb the waste every day. For those who don't know, it means you bury it every day. You put it under 6 inches of dirt every day. Makes sense, right? It's like what your cats do. I mean, come on. So I mean, we figured this out a long time ago, y'all. Like way before this stage of evolution, we figured that you should bury this stuff. And so we do that. That's what's required. But they've actually created a system called alternative daily cover. Where they can do things like use a tarp. Just put a tarp down there. Like, don't y'all worry. This is a state-of-the-art tarp, y'all. This is heavily engineered. It's not just like a normal tarp. It's like it's a tarp, guys. We know what we're talking about. Or they'll like spray it down with a foam. In some instances with odor control, they even just use like giant sprayers that essentially have Febreze in them that are spraying it all over a landfill face. I'm not even kidding. And then what they've got in some, one that's really fun, and by fun I mean horrifying, is in Beaumont, they're trying to use contaminated soils for alternative daily cover. These are soils from like oil fields that are too contaminated to put into the landfill, but they're using them as cover on the landfill. And if our environmental agency has anything to say about it, that will get a rubber stamp. So we have great legislation in front of the Texas legislature this year. It's going to address pretty much everything I mentioned is going to be have at least one bill dealing with it, including several others. They are being filed predominantly by Republican lawmakers. Most notably, Ed Thompson from Pearland is doing a lot of that. He's got a bad landfill in his district, and it's actually across the street from his district, but his constituents are impacted by that. We've also got Dwayne Bohack, who's from West Houston, who's got stuff. Senator Joan Huffman, Senator Judith Zaffirini, who's a Democrat, and who some of y'all, if you live in South Austin, might know her, might be in her district. She's doing a lot of stuff because there's a bad problem facility or proposal in Laredo. So, that's the kind of the kind of long and short of it. I wanted to talk more about the Austin Community Landfill. I will just say briefly before I open it up for questions that if anybody wants to ask about it, I can elaborate on that. But there is a fight over that right now. We are preparing for a potential expansion attempt at some point. They're going to try and expand it sooner or later. We are getting ahead of that and organizing neighbors on that right now. If you don't want that to happen, you need to weigh in with your city council members and your county commissioners saying stop the expansion of this facility. And right now, the city government is trying to essentially greenwash that landfill and say that it's a good landfill to send our materials to, even though there's a lot of potential liability for every taxpayer in the city if we send our wastes there. And we are working to push back against that policy as well. I can elaborate if anybody has questions about that. But, I think that's the most important thing here is, please support Texas Campaign for the Environment, and please support folks that are fighting waste facilities in their community. Please be conscientious about what you're doing with your waste on a daily basis. This is why recycling and composting and source reduction and reuse are so important. But really, our personal behavior is only a tip of the iceberg. Right? Our personal behavior will not solve the problem because the problem is systemic. And if we just change our behaviors within these systems, the systems will destroy us. We have to shift these systems. We have to find ways of making it so that we're no longer throwing things away and sending things out of sight and out of mind, but making sure that we are being conscientious and responsible with every resource that we consume in this country and around the world. So, happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Andrew. And if you have a question, please raise your hand. I'll come by.
Do y'all have something like a guide for shoppers? Like, what are the best containers to, what's the least obnoxious?
Right.
For lack of a better word, to the worst. And also, I've been interested in what's the life cycle of what we put in our single stream recycling. Is there a way for us to know, like, when you put it in, where does it really end up? Thanks.
Yeah, those are both great questions, and thank you for that. The short answer to your first one is no, we don't have any resource like that immediately. We probably should. We should probably talk about that. David's done some really great stuff in the past on this sort of thing. But I would say that the most important thing is to buy things in bulk and to not buy new containers when you buy products, to reuse containers as much as possible. Now that's not always easy to do, but I'd say that things that easily go into your recycling container are the next best thing, right? Or that you can reuse around the house indefinitely. That's even better. But if you're like me, you end up with like a cabinet full of jars, and you're like, what am I going to do with all these jars? My girlfriend's even just like, can we just get rid of some of the jars? I know it's not great. And I'm like, yeah, okay. So we got a little bit more use out of them. So that's what I'd say. In terms of the life cycle of our recyclables, we've got two really great processors here in town, in Texas Disposal Systems down south and in Balcones Resources up north. And both of them are very responsible and effective operators on this stuff. They are still marketing every bit of the recyclables that we get. And just to kind of give a very brief answer, you send things in the blue bin, it goes to a facility called a Materials Recovery Facility, or a MRF, that uses a lot of really cool machinery to sort things out. By the way, if you want to see this sort of stuff, Texas Campaign for the Environment is having our annual meeting March 31st at Texas Disposal Systems, so you get to see it all when you go down there. So please join us. You can become a member online. Go to texasenvironment.org, join there, and we'll make sure we'll be sending out some information about that. So please come join us on March 31st to see that. But it sorts it out into different categories of things that they then bail up, and then they sell those on the open market to people that want to buy them and process them into new materials. And for the most part around here, it is going to domestic markets, manufacturers here in Texas or in Louisiana or other parts of the world around here, or they're going to Mexico. In other parts of the world on the West Coast, a lot of that stuff's been going to China for years. And now that China has said, we don't want your bad materials anymore, it has disrupted a lot of markets. That has not necessarily been the case here. We are still getting to sell all of our materials, and they are being recycled at this point. So yeah.
Two questions I have. I wish you would elaborate on. One is, yes, tell us more about the Sunshine farms.
Sunset Farms, yeah.
Whatever,
Sunshine Farms is even better.
Whatever ridiculous name they've given it, and what we can do to help with that. And second, the bills that you mentioned. Do you have numbers for those bills, and can you tell us what those numbers are so folks here in the audience today could tell us what to do? Should we call people about supporting those bills or what? And the people in the video audience who will see this video, we want them to know too what those bills are and how they can help make sure those bills get passed.
Yes, thank you so much for that. I'll answer the second one first. There are, in fact, a lot of bill numbers. I thought about it. I was like, I don't necessarily want to list off a whole, mess of bills here, and I didn't want to create a lot of paperwork for you either. But you can go to texasenvironment.org/legislation and see our legislative priorities there, and we do have a list of all those bills there that you can see also on some other issues that we're working on as well. You can see that. So that's a great resource for seeing that information. In terms of, it's actually the Sunset Farms landfill actually ceased operating in 2015. I don't say closed because it's still an active permit, and we worry that could be used they have engineered it as a closed landfill, but that active permit gives us a lot of concern. It's the Austin Community Landfill, which is Waste Management's landfill, that's still operating there. And, in the month of January, they had over 150 complaints filed with TCEQ at the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, our state environmental agency. They had over 150 complaints filed with TCEQ at that facility, mostly from odor. And there's also been a lot of news lately about feral hogs in that part of the world. I don't know if people have seen that, and we believe that's probably connected to the landfill over there. There have been a variety of other problems from it, and people there are fed up with it. And so that's something that we're working on. I would say that right now it's at kind of an early stage, and so we're working with some of our elected officials, Natasha Harper-Madison, the city council member, the new city council member up there. She's been great on this. Jeff Trevelyan has been working on these issues since long before he was a county commissioner. He's great on this. Bridget Shea, who's actually on our board of directors, the county commissioner, has also been really good on this, as well as Leslie Poole, who is right here in this part of the world as a city council member. She's been a leader on this. So we've been working with them on kind of seeing what we can do. Also with Celia Israel, the state representative out there, who actually lives in the neighborhood right next to the landfill, which is somewhat convenient for us, not so convenient for her, that she gets this issue very personally and knows that it's a very serious concern for her and her neighbors. So we're working with a lot of those people. I think that weighing in with your council members and commissioners and legislators, letting them know, hey, this issue is important to me. I will say this really quickly. I'll try to keep this brief, but one of the big concerns with that site is that prior to the National Environmental Protection Act, in the early 1970s. That site was an industrial waste dump, okay? And they brought in tens of thousands of barrels of industrial waste from all over the region and all over Texas and dumped it there. And it was an aggressive amount of waste because all these operators knew that NEPA was coming. They knew the Clean Water Act was coming. They knew these things were coming down, and so they were furiously trying to get to dump as much of their waste as they could at this point. And there is at least 21,000 barrels of industrial waste in unlined sections of that landfill over there. And we have reason to believe that many of those chemicals have seeped into the ground and potentially into groundwater there. It's not well established, but we have every reason to believe that could be happening. And that site is going to have to be remediated at some point, and it's likely going to be tens of millions of dollars to do so at the very least. It is a potential future Superfund site right there. It is a disaster. And the way that those laws work is that anybody that dumps into the landfills there could potentially have liability for helping to clean that up, right? You are jointly and severally liable under those laws. If the city of Austin sends waste to the Austin Community Landfill, every time that we send extends our potential liability further. Okay, that is something that I take really seriously and that everybody should take seriously, whether you live next to that landfill or not. And right now the city government has been using a variety of mechanisms to try and gussy up that landfill in order to justify sending more waste there, and therefore increasing our potential liability as taxpayers and ratepayers in this city. That is something that we cannot tolerate. We have to say, no, do not send waste to the Austin Community Landfill. Stop dumping on our neighbors, and don't be adopting policies that greenwash one of the worst polluted sites in Central Texas. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you for being here. I'm Dale Beulah. Our blue bins that we put out every other week, there's a little label on the top that says no plastic bags.
Yes, sir.
I can't tell you how many times I look inside and people put all their recycles in a plastic bag.
Yeah.
I had been told that when that plastic bag gets to the recycling center, it just goes into the trash. And instead of being recycled because because it gums up all their stuff. The plastic gums up the works. Is that accurate? And if so, I've put articles in our neighborhood newsletter saying don't put your recycles in a plastic bag, but who reads the newsletter? I don't know.
Right, exactly. The most important answer is, yeah, you're right. You're not supposed to put any plastic film into your blue bins here in Austin. If people happen to be seeing this in Georgetown, I believe that they have a system where they can actually put film into a bag on top of their container. But yeah, you're not supposed to be putting any film in there because it does get into the machinery and cause problems. Now, that said, because so many people do it, they have started to have some systems for being able to cut the bags away and whatnot. But we talk about sanitation workers being a dangerous job. Those recycling workers have a dangerous job, and they are much lower paid and oftentimes don't have the protections of unions and that sort of thing, oftentimes immigrant labor and that sort of thing. And so that, asking them to cut open bags all the time, this is where a lot of injuries can happen there. So you're putting people at real risk when you are putting your things in a bag like that. As to whether or not they're throwing them away, I'm not sure. I'm sure that to a great extent they are because they end up getting trashy. But they may be gathering. I think I've seen them gather up film at the Murph Center area and bale those and market them. But it's still going to be really low quality, right? For that stuff. What you should be doing is keeping your recyclables out of the bag. I have like a little, Rubbermaid tub that I put mine in and just dump it into the container when it's ready to go. And then your film that you do have, if you have like bread bags or stuff like that, you should not be using single-use plastic bags. Even though that ordinance got struck down, people should not be using them. But then you can bag those things up, and they have recycling for that at most grocery stores.
Howdy, Dobbs. Thanks
Hey, Roy.
for being here. Great presentation. And thank you. Their Representative Gina Hinojosa is putting a bag ban redo bill to allow us to do that. And I know that TEC is largely responsible for that and deeply involved. Are you also going to be looking at putting deposits own bottles, glass, and plastic to give an incentive financially to recycle?
That's a great question. Thank you. And yeah, we have been helping Representative Hinojosa with her bills, House Bill 514 and House Bill 856, both of which would restore our rights and even extend the rights beyond what we had before in order to deal with plastic pollution at the local level. In terms of bottle and can deposits, no, not this session. We have worked on that in the past. It didn't go very far, unfortunately, because the bottling industry is such a powerful lobby and they are so dead set against it. It's one of those policies that if you put it on the ballot in the state of Texas, should we have bottle and can deposits, you get 85% of the vote, right? Like, it's a very popular policy. It works really well. It's not like anybody's out there saying, oh, I'm not going to buy this six-pack because it's now 30 cents more, right? It's probably raising 30 cents anyways without you even realizing it, right? But for whatever reason, I believe it's just because of a kind of reactionary refusal to have any kind of regulation on their industry. The bottling industry has fought that. And so in the past, when we've worked on it, it hasn't really gone very far. We could work on it again. It's just this session. It's too late this session for sure. But without some strong allies on it, it hasn't been. We haven't seen that as the best use of our resources and energy, which limited as they are. I will say that in the 10 states that have bottle and can deposits, they recycle about 2/3 of the beverage containers recycled in this country in 10 states. So it is a very successful and proven policy, and you're right, we need to do it here sooner or later too.
I've heard that we're going to run out of space in the current landfill, or the landfill you mentioned in like the next 6 to 10 years, something like that. If we continue disposing at our current rate. I don't know if that's accurate or not. But what would be a good alternative, like practically, like in the next 6 to divert to our waste? And could you vision cast on the dream landfill? Like if we can't get to total zero waste, like what would that look like?
Well, let me answer this. Yeah, I can answer both of those. Thank you for that. So that landfill is going to fill up in the next probably 6 to 8 years, maybe a little bit more, a little bit less, probably not much more than that. That's probably on the long end in that 8 years there. And when it does, this is the Austin Community Landfill. When it does, we're hoping that it won't expand. We've got the Texas Disposal Landfill down in southeast Travis County, which is an ideal facility in a lot of ways. You also have there is a landfill in Hutto as well. There's also a landfill in New Braunfels, there's a landfill in Temple, and in many parts of the country, those are distances that people drive for their waste. And frankly, again, we don't necessarily need to be worried about keeping our trash cheap. We need to, we need to have trash that accurately reflects the costs that it has in our society, and it's not cheap in that instance. So I'm not worried about trying to keep our trash cheap. I'm worried about, I believe that if our trash is a little bit more expensive, then we might start to see our recycling and composting make sense. And that kind of answers your second question, which is, zero waste sounds like this scary thing, but the practices and policies that we need to do it are things that exist right here, right now. There is nothing special that we need for the vast majority of this. A majority of what we throw away is recyclable in our blue bins, right? The trash we're throwing away, a majority of it, more than half gone right there. So you have 6 to 8 years. Now you would have 12 to 16 years, right? You just doubled it, okay? Then the majority of what's left after that is compostable, right? Is stuff that if you have the green bin already, you can throw it in there. If you don't have the green bin already, you will soon. If you live in multifamily, we need to be working with us to press our local government to find solutions for multifamily as well, right? So now you're talking about going from 12 to 16 to 24 to 32 years. Now we're not really worried about it anymore. And what's left then are things like a lot of complex products, most of which the manufacturers themselves should be responsible for taking care of this, kind of like what we've done with TVs and computers. TCE helped lead the fight on that. We need to do that with those. And then what you're left with are things like baby diapers and ceramics, and I think if that's what we're left with, and we've extended the lives of our landfills by a factor of 20 or so, we'll live with that. That's what I would say is the ideal, is to just get as much of it out of there as possible. And the systems that we have now will work. What we don't have right now, and what we need, and what is TCE's job to help make, and what everybody here can contribute towards, is the political will to make that happen. because it is difficult, because you're asking people to resist the culture of throwing things away that we've been inculcated with. We have to get rid of that. We have to resist that. We have to push back on that and have the political will to make tough decisions. Because we can't do this, and I want to hear from Joyce too, if we can't do this, if we can't get people to throw their recyclables into their blue bins, how do we expect to solve the really big problems that we're facing in terms of climate change, water consumption, and everything else? If we can't do this, then we can't do any of it, and we have to do it. So yes, thank you.
I'm Joyce. You've had some good success with getting electronics manufacturers to be much more conscious of recycling the stuff they put into our hands. What, if anything, is being done with excessive food packaging and the business of putting things into our hands in collapsible mayonnaise containers? I hadn't seen those.
Yeah, that's a great question. There are a lot of people who are working on it. It's interesting. I think that the kind of plastics fight right now is really shifting gears in some important and valuable ways. I think that, for a while there was a lot of push on extended producer responsibility, which is the concept EPR. It's a concept that manufacturers should be responsible for the end of life of their products. Another way of internalizing those externalities, right? But there was a push for EPR for packaging. That is kind of stalled out, to be honest, for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that they were kind of depending upon the packaging companies playing ball with them. Packaging companies were kind of afraid that Congress or the EPA was going to do something with them. I think after Trump came into power, they were kind of like, well, we don't have anything to worry about here, so we're not going to help y'all. And then the whole thing is kind of stalled out. Where the plastics fight really is right now, and this is really interesting, is that you're seeing a shift in perspective, where they are starting to look at the entire life cycle of plastics. And rather than just thinking about the end of life, they're starting to think about the beginning of life. And we're starting to see a lot more push on extraction and tying together the fights against fracking and the fights against plastic pollution and the fights for ocean conservation. These things are all starting to come together right now in really exciting ways, and against the initial processing. So right now, Texas Campaign for the Environment is working with allies in South Texas, in Portland, Texas, and Gregory, Texas, which are outside of Corpus Christi, where they plan on building the world's largest ethane cracker. It's going to be owned by an ExxonMobil subsidiary in conjunction with the Saudi royal family. And it's going to be like the world's largest ethane cracker. Ethane is a byproduct of natural gas. When you crack it, it creates fractions that are then used for plastics production. So I think that the real fight right now is against is the build out and the infrastructure of the plastics industry and forcing the plastic and really taking the fight right there. So, it's not we need to do more on that back end, on the disposal end. And I think, there's a lot of different things that we could be doing and we will be doing over the course of the future. But right now, I think there's been a strategic shift towards saying, hey, let's work with, let's tie this to environmental justice, tie this to racial justice, let's tie this to the fight against climate change and the fight against extraction industries, and join forces so that it's not the recycling nerds over here, the ocean people over here, the oil and gas people over here, the climate people over here, but let's really combine forces and fight at the point where we all are joined. Does that make sense?
Andrew, if you'd please repeat your website once again.
Yeah, texasenvironment.org. Also, just so you'll know, this week is Amplify Austin, if you're seeing this before Friday. So Texas Campaign for the Environment Fund, our 501c3 sister organization, is going to be raising up to $15,000. But texasenvironment.org, you can also find us on Facebook.
Andrew Dobbs. Andrew, thank you for being with us today to talk trash to us. And we appreciate your work, and we appreciate your work for Texas and Commission or Texas Environmental Quality. Thank you.